year before I was born, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed on July 26, 1990. Even though my physical birth came at the peak of this groundbreaking law that would protect individuals with disabilities across the nation, I was still pretty young. Matter of fact, I wasn't even born. And I was ignorant in how this protection of this law would later serve me in my adult years. In the U.S., adults with disabilities are protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA. And the ADA defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one's or major life activities, a person who has a history or a record of such impairment, or a person who is perceived as having such an impairment. Under this act, individuals with facial deformities are also covered by this clause because it has in which I like to refer to as the perception clause, which reads, a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. You know, in the facial difference community, perception is a big thing. Unlike mobile, physical, or even invisible disabilities, when people see a facial deformity or disfigurement, they tend to assume a plethora of things. And among that list of the things among assumptions also lies a perception of perceived incompetence. I'll use myself for example. I was born with two rare conditions, Vader syndrome and Goldenhar syndrome. Both of these rare conditions consist of internal and external congenital birth defects and abnormalities. Now, Vader syndrome is a more invisible condition. However, Goldenhar syndrome consists of both invisible and visible differences. Goldenhar syndrome is also considered a craniofacial condition, which is any condition or disease that impacts the head and or face. Now, when people see me, they may notice my crooked smile and my missing ear. Well, I'll say this. Depending on how I'm wearing my hair these days, the ear can be very easily overlooked. Nevertheless, only one trait of these two complex medical conditions make me disabled. And only one phrase in the ADA inducts me into the class of protected persons. And that is because I am perceived by others as having a disability. People have always perceived that I was disabled, whether I disclose to them or not my technical disability. When others get a glimpse of me, they'll see my crooked mouth and my missing ear, and they'll assume, oh, she has a disability. There's something wrong with her. But my crooked face is not my disability. Me not having an ear, which results in unilateral hearing loss and deafness, is my disability. But you would be surprised in how many people perceive me to be on this disability scale because of the differenceness of my face. And from this lifelong lived experience, I'm all too familiar with the misguided belief of having the perceived incompetence and how it so deeply impacts individuals who look different. I can stand as a witness and say in my lifetime, I've had my fair issue of issues. I'm sorry. I'll start that over.
Fair share?
Huh?
What was the, sorry, what was the line? Your fair share of issues?
Yeah, my fair share of issues,
gotcha.
but my words kind of got mixed up. I can stand as a witness and say that in my lifetime, I have had my fair share in issues and injustices related to me being perceived as being different. And despite me being a part of a protected class of citizens, socially and emotionally, I still felt very much exposed and vulnerable. I didn't know then, but there always seemed to be a hardship trailing behind me, a hardship that this law, the ADA, could not answer to. And that was the perception from my non-disabled peers. That perception and that judgment suggesting that because my face was different, because my smile was crooked, because I was missing an ear, that somehow translated to me missing intelligence and understanding. This perceived incompetence reinforced biases that can constantly question my abilities. This perceived incompetence turned a blind eye to staring and intrusive questioning. This perceived incompetence fueled ableism, in which we understand is a social discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Now, although we in the disability community understand that there is a wide spectrum in the disability field and impacts the lives of disabled individuals differently, we know disability is not a monolith and is no indication on one's ability to perform, to show up, or how they choose to live in their society. Nevertheless, although the ADA seems to understand what disability is or isn't, those in our society are still stuck on those negative misperceptions. You know, when we look at the word disability, it's highly stigmatized. I mean, even looking at the historical context surrounding disability, it really stems from a medical construct, which approaches disability as a deficit problem, something that needs to be fixed. And due to this long history of this negative stigma in this historical context, the perception of perceived incompetence is really embedded into our typical interaction and behavior towards disabled individuals. In many ways, individuals with disabilities face this belief system on a day-to-day basis, and most non-disabled people are completely oblivious to it until it's pointed out, kind of like what I'm doing here today. I could say in the core areas of my life, in environments that I've had to navigate through, I have experienced the perceived incompetence belief system in many different ways. In the educational system, I experienced perceived incompetence when I was placed in a special education classroom well below my ability level and my skills. And this was all due to perceived incompetence of people seeing my facial difference and assuming my lack of intelligence. In the employment setting, I remember a time where I was on a job search and I went to this employment agency, and instead of doing an assessment of my skills, my abilities, my education level, I was placed in a warehouse packaging boxes. I wasn't asked about my career goals or aspirations, or even if I had a high school diploma or a college degree. I was simply placed in a position to fulfill a quota so that company could say that they hired someone with a disability. This is because of perceived incompetence. In my places of faith and worship, I wasn't introduced to my relationship with God as God being someone to have a spiritual experience with. But more so, I was pressured to seek God, to see how could He cure me of this disability and disease. And instead of having a human and spiritual experience, I was perceived as being incompetent of experiencing those things. In the social settings, being a Black woman with a disability, people don't think that we exist. And yet we are consistently excluded from conversations surrounding beauty. We are perceived as being incompetent, and that our voices and our perspectives are not relevant in the standards of beauty and how society looks at women. I felt this burden throughout my whole life. The burden of having a disability speak for me whenever I enter a room. This burden became especially heavy as an adult, that I could just not explain the difficulty I was facing. I knew that there was this belief system working against me. In times where I did not disclose or show any type of lack of understanding or incompetency, I found myself denied opportunities based upon the assumption of my ability to perform due to my physical appearance. I was not given the chance to provide clarity or an explanation, but a choice was made for me. And I found myself placed into a category that I never asked to be a part of. I came to recognize this belief system as an invisible barrier. And this invisible barrier is known as perceived incompetence. You know, perceived incompetence is not so much seen by the natural eye, but it is felt among those who stand as her prey. I spent a lot of time in my adult life trying to fight against this belief system, against this invisible barrier of perceived incompetence. At times, it forced me to go above and beyond, going way out of my way, trying to prove myself and my ability. I even had an internalized belief system that whispered to me, saying, if I can appear to be as normal as possible, maybe they will accept me. You know, we talk about in our culture how we have internalized racism, which is basically the notion that one looks at their race as being inferior. Well, the same notion can apply to internalized ableism that tells us that disabilities are inferior as well. And I had to overcome that too. Having the appearance of a disability can sometimes put you at a disadvantage, because many in our culture and in our environment hold on to belief systems unknowingly that equate disability to less than and or inferior. Hence, when non-disabled individuals meet a person with a disability, the question of incompetence is already framed. And this sets up an invisible barrier in which now the person with the disability is tasked with having to deconstruct. Many times, the responsibility of addressing this invisible barrier is left up to the individuals with disabilities themselves. And it's not a shared concern among both disabled and non-disabled partners. Addressing misconceptions and false beliefs around disability should not solely rely on disabled individuals. It should also be the responsibility of our non-disabled peers. Because those in the disability community desire to share the burden of being disabled instead of being siloed in a human experience. So what do? How will we remedy the belief of perceived incompetence? Well, I would say first, we have to expand our current definition of what disability is and push back against any notion that can limit or hinder a person's ability to thrive. Secondly, we have to intentionally create space for the protections of people with disabilities to grow and to not be so reliant on the definitions and the confines of the law, such as the ADA. You know, when I think back about my negative experiences related to being disabled, the ADA was not enough. The ADA could not protect me against implicit bias. The ADA could not protect me against teasing and bullying. The ADA could not protect me against awkward stares because of my facial difference. Although the law mentions the perception, the law cannot protect against prejudice. We have to change the way disability is perceived in our society. And that comes through education, communication, and the willingness to see disabled people exactly the way that they are, which in my opinion is beautiful and very well capable.